Tēnā koutou katoa, kei Oranga Tamaraki aho e mahi ana, ko Sarah Richardson tōku ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you everyone. As Rosie has already helpfully explained, today I'm going to talk to you about a piece of analysis we've done in the Evidence Centre looking at pathways to youth justice and what some of the wellbeing indicators and outcomes look like for young people that go through youth justice compared to those that don't. So I thought it would be helpful to start off and tell you a little bit about why we've done this analysis. There's many reasons why you'd want to look at pathways through youth justice, but one of the driving reasons we did this was that there is a commonly held perception that the care and protection system churns out young people into youth justice, which in turn churns out adults who go on to offend and end up in prison. And while that is the reality for a small number of people, in reality, it's a lot more complicated. So as we were scoping this up, we thought not only do we want to answer that question, but we want to look at what these people look like at 3 different points in their life. So we want to know what's happening for these people in terms of their wellbeing and underlying factors before they enter youth justice. We want to know what they look like in terms of those things at around age 17 when they're aging out of the remit of youth justice and Oranga Tamaraki. And then we want to know what happens to them when they leave us. Do they go on and end up serving a prison sentence? Do they stop offending? And what does their wellbeing look like? So the only way that we could do this analysis was by using the IDI, which Kay has very helpfully explained for me what the IDI is. So we pulled out a bunch of indicators from data in the IDI around education, benefits, status, housing, health, for people born in New Zealand between 1993 and 2002. And this meant that we could look at them from childhood and follow them through into early adulthood. For this cohort, we cut them into, that sounds awful, we segmented them into 4 groups. And we did this based on their statutory involvement with Oranga Tamariki. So when I say statutory involvement for youth justice, that means that they've got at least as far in youth justice as having a youth justice family group conference. And for care and protection, I mean that they've got as far as having a care and protection family group conference. So we have 4 groups. The first group here is our crossover group. And the crossover group are those people that have had statutory involvement in both care and protection and youth justice. And they make up a very small proportion of this cohort. The second group we have is the youth justice only group. And those are the people that have only had statutory involvement with youth justice, no stat involvement with care and protection. So these are our 2 youth justice groups. As a comparison, we also looked at people who had only care and protection statutory involvement, and then also the rest of that cohort, which is by far the largest group. They have never had statutory involvement with Oranga Tamariki. In terms of what these groups look like demographically, our youth justice only groups, which won't be a surprise to a lot of you, Māori are overrepresented, as they are in care and protection, but more so for youth justice. And in terms of gender, these youth justice groups the majority of them are male. What's quite interesting about this though is that in this crossover group, where there's a little bit more complexity, there is a higher proportion of females than those that just go through youth justice. So in the slides I'm going to show you, there is a lot of detail. Don't worry about focusing in on it too much. There is a paper published online, so if there's anything that catches your eye, you can go back and look at that. So if I gloss over something, it's all available for you. So the first part of the analysis was looking at what happens for people before they enter youth justice. And for this first part, it's just focused on those 2 youth justice groups because obviously the others did not get involved in youth justice. And so what this really showed us is that young people involved in youth justice have a range of complex factors and things happening for them before they even get there. So there's a lot of opportunity for early engagement with them to perhaps take them down a different path. But what we found in the years before a young person's first YJFGC is that about 80% of them had had a report of concern to Oranga Tamariki, which didn't go as far as an FGC, obviously. Around half had been truant from school at some point in their lives, and their rates of mental health and substance use treatment were higher in that year before they had their YJFGC. An important thing to consider when looking at these as well is that it's not one of these factors in isolation that means someone is going to have interaction with youth justice. It's the combination of all these things together and all the other things they have going on that we can't measure, like their cultural connectedness and social bonds, identity, all those things that form a larger picture. But for the things that we can measure, I'll show you some of those. So I'm going to show you some journey diagrams. Again, don't try and digest it all. These are all online. But these show the proportion of young people that had care and protection interactions and family violence notifications leading up to their first youth justice FGC. So these little people on the side, that represents the age they were when they had their first YJFGC. These are their indicators down here. So for example, we look at 16-year-olds who had their first YJFGC at 16. 7% of those people had a care and protection out-of-home placement in the year before that FGC, and then 6% in the 1 to 2 years before, and 8% in the 2 to 5 years before. And what we generally found is that the proportions vary across age, but they tend to be higher for people that have their first interaction at a younger age. And if you look at, for example, the family violence notifications, people that had their first YJFGC at age 13, 50% of those had had a family violence notification in the year before, and then as you go up these age ranges, it decreases a little bit. So we also have this information for education. So again, it varies by age, but broadly the picture is here that truancy, stand down and suspension spells kind of increase in frequency as you're leading up to the first YJFGC, suggesting that you're seeing a pattern of behaviour and non-attendance before they even get to start to address offending behaviour. Again, mental health and substance use treatment is quite high in the years before the first YJFGC and varies by age. What's important to note about these mental health and substance use treatment indicators is that they are not a measure of prevalence of mental health issues in the population. They are just that an issue has been identified in those people who've had some kind of treatment, whether it's cognitive behavioural therapy or like a pharmaceutical treatment. So, and some of that may have come out of addressing offending behaviour or other behaviours that have been seen before they get to a YJFGC. So that gives you an idea of what these YJ kids look like before they get to YJ. Then we looked at what is happening for them in their lives at 17 as they're about to leave us and go off into the adult justice system. So we've back to our 4 groups now because we've got some comparators. And unsurprisingly, the crossover group seems to fare worse across than the YJ only group. So the crossover group were more likely to have committed an offence in the previous 12 months, more likely to have been in a youth justice placement, like a residence, than those that had only had youth justice experience. They're more likely to be subject of a report of concern to Oranga Tamariki. They're more likely to have been in a care and protection placement, and they had generally low wellbeing across education, income, health, and they're more likely to experience victimisation. So a whole lot of complex factors happening there. So this just shows you the proportion of people in each group who committed an offence in the year before turning 17. So you can see from this that being involved in YJ obviously was a huge factor, but the crossover group were more likely to commit an offence than the YJ only group in the previous 12 months, whether it was a low level offence or a high level offence. I'm going to show you some of these tables. Don't worry about the numbers so much. What we're looking at here is the shading in these tables. So we've got our groups across the top. The red shading indicates that they're faring worse than the other groups, and the blue means they're faring better. So what you'll see across the care and protection indicators is that the crossover group is faring a lot worse than the YJ only group. In terms of socioeconomic well-being, the crossover group were far more likely to have had residential changes in the previous 12 months, and they were more likely to live in a low decile area. So that kind of just signifies for us kind of housing instability and instability in their situation, which might make it a bit harder to deal with some of the underlying issues that they're having. Education indicators we looked at age 17 as well. So again, you can see that red is highly skewed towards the crossover group. Although what is interesting about the education indicators is that if you look at the proportion of these YJ groups who were enrolled in school in the previous year, they're very similar for youth justice. And then when you come down to those that are enrolled in a tertiary course, excluding bachelor level, they're actually higher than for our care and protection and no involvement groups. So that's suggesting that even though they haven't been in high school, they have been in some form of education like Polytech or some NZQA course. Again, this is a measure of being enrolled. It doesn't tell you anything about achievement or how long they were in it for. Also a higher likelihood that they've been truant from school in the previous year, and for those YJ groups, again, it's much higher than for just care and protection and the general population. I'll just gloss over that one quickly. So health indicators, these mental health and substance use treatment rates are a lot higher for these groups for the reasons I discussed earlier, that they may have been identified as part of addressing offending. One interesting one here is that the YJ groups, particularly the crossover group, have a higher rate of emergency department admissions in the previous year. And this could be because of risk-taking behaviour associated with offending, or it could also be that because it's higher for CP only as well, that sometimes people just can't afford to go to the GP and therefore they present at an emergency department. One of the most staggering stats, I think, in this thing is that at age 17, just over half of that crossover group have experienced a family violence incident in their immediate family, which when you look at it compared to, the no involvement group is far higher, and even far higher than those that have just been involved in youth justice or just in care and protection. Cool. So you've seen what it looked like before they came into youth justice, what it looks like as they're ageing out, and now we're going to look at what it looks like for these people between the ages of 17 and 21 once they've left the remit of Oranga Tamaraki. And this is the part that people get the most excited about, because it's like, are we creating this pathway to prison? So again, I kind of use the crossover group as the comparison group because they seem to be the ones that have the worst results and are the most complex. Our crossover group by age 22 were more likely to commit an offence, and they offended at a higher rate. They were more likely to receive a sentence administered by corrections, so a community sentence like home detention, intensive supervision, or a prison sentence. They're more likely to receive multiple sentences, and this was followed in order kind of by the youth justice only group, care and protection only, and then the no involvement. If we look at offending indicators for these groups between 17 and 21, you can see that obviously those that were involved in YJ at all were far more likely to commit an offence in early adulthood than those that weren't. It was 85% for the crossover group and 80% for YJ only, so still very likely to commit an offence. When you look at the average number of offences committed, it's higher for the crossover group, followed by the YJ only group, and then CP only, which is much lower than our YJ groups there. So this one is showing you the proportion of each group that received a sentence administered by corrections. So the orange here is the proportion that received a prison sentence by the age of 22. The green is a community sentence, and the grey is no sentence. Now these people, even though they didn't receive a sentence from corrections, they may have been to court and received a fine, but because it's not administered by corrections, it's not counted in here. What the massive difference is here that you can see is that this crossover group, a quarter of them received a prison sentence compared to only 11% of that YJ only group, which is quite a big difference. There wasn't too much difference in terms of community sentences, but prison was the big one. And another interesting thing to come out of this was that those people that only had interaction with care and protection and no YJ involvement, actually only 2% of them received a prison sentence, which goes to show that misconception that the care system kind of churns out kids into prison is untrue. This is just a view of that same graph, except it's split by ethnicity, just to show you what it looks like for Māori. So the outcomes for Māori in terms of prison, which won't be a surprise to many of you working in the criminal justice system, is higher. 27% of Māori in that crossover group received a prison sentence, compared with 18% of non-Māori. And it kind of graduates down as you get down to the no involvement group there. Again, this is just a view of the same graph. It just shows you the number of sentences that these groups are receiving. So the red is that the most serious sentence they've received is a prison sentence, and in total they've received 4 different sentences. It might be like 3 prison sentences, 1 community, or it might be 1 prison, 2 community. But what it's really getting at is that it's speaking to the complexity of this group and the I guess the level of their offending and the things going on for them there. We also looked at some wellbeing indicators for these people between the ages of 17 and 21 to see what else was happening for them. So you can see that for benefit status, these statutory groups, actually quite a large proportion of all of them received a main benefit at some point, but it was particularly high for that crossover group. The YJ only and the CP only, there was not a huge difference there. And that crossover group was also more likely to live in social housing for some of that period. So for education and employment between the ages of 17 and 21, a very high proportion of those with statutory involvement in either care and protection or youth justice have not been in employment, education or training at least some of the time during early adulthood. And yet also a high proportion of them have also been in employment, education and training at least some of the time. If you compare that to the no involvement population at 54% here and 99% here, these just kind of speak a little bit more to instability, that they're not consistently in some form of education or employment. And the enrolment in bachelor level tertiary courses is very low for these youth justice groups. Low for care and protection as well, but only 1% of that crossover group was enrolled in university level education. Again, the mental health and ED and hospitalisation stats are much worse for those youth justice only groups. You'll notice these are a lot higher than some of the earlier mental health stats that I showed you, and that's probably just because as they've got older, there's been more opportunity to identify issues that need to be addressed. So we do expect to see an escalation in those as they get through life, but still staggeringly high. So that's all I have for you today. But so the main things to take away from this really are that just because someone goes through youth justice doesn't mean they're going to end up in prison. So there's a 24% of that crossover group and 11% of the YJ only group. The crossover group is small, but they have the most complex factors and needs, and so they're a very important group to look at and help. If you want to see all the research underlying this, there's a lot more detail and discussion, you can go to our website, and it's published on there alongside with a piece from YJ Ops, which kind of details some of the programs and things they're doing that speak to some of these results, like supported bail programs. And if you have any questions that you don't get to us today, or you just want to have a chat, feel free to email us at research@ot.govt.nz. Thank you.